The psychological devastation had actually commenced 3 weeks before this airborne spectacle, back on March 7, 1945, when something previously deemed impossible had already occurred. Lieutenant Karl Timmermann, a man born in Frankfurt in 1921 but serving the American cause, had spearheaded advance elements of the 9th Armoured Division in capturing the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen while it still stood intact. German High Command initially dismissed these reports as enemy deception. General Major Karl Wagner, serving as Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, would later provide testimony at Nuremberg, describing how they initially assumed the reports constituted propaganda because no military force could possibly advance with such velocity. No assault could succeed without extensive preparation. Yet within mere hours, American forces were streaming across like floodwaters through a ruptured dam. Russian prisoners during the First World War had laboured to construct this bridge, and German engineers had wired it with approximately 2,800 kilograms of demolition charges. When the moment came to destroy it, only partial detonation occurred because the explosives, civilian-grade Donnerite, proved catastrophically inadequate. The bridge would eventually collapse from accumulated damage 10 days later, taking the lives of 28 American engineers and injuring 93 more. But by that point, the damage was done, because American forces had already accomplished something. German military doctrine declared mathematically impossible. Major Hans-Georg Model, son of Field Marshal Walter Model and serving as an engineer officer with Army Group B, maintained meticulous technical documentation that survived the war's conclusion. His notes from March 15th recorded observations of American engineers assembling what appeared to be an enormous construction toy across the Rhine. He described how the Americans and British possessed a bridge that connected like children's building blocks. The Bailey Bridge, invented by British engineer Donald Bailey, who had pursued model bridge construction as a hobby before hostilities began, required no specialised tools or heavy machinery for assembly. Components were sufficiently light that standard trucks could transport them and human hands could position them, yet they possessed enough structural integrity to support 60-ton tanks. Every component was interchangeable, Model noted in his documentation. German General Lobust Alfred Schleim, commanding the 1st Parachute Army, had confidently assured his staff during Rhine defence planning that any Allied airborne operation would face severe limitations, perhaps a brigade at most, certainly no more than 2, because the Allies supposedly lacked sufficient transport capacity for anything larger. German intelligence had estimated they would confront roughly 7,000 infantry defending the Rhine crossing zones. Reality would prove devastatingly different. As night fell on March 23rd and Allied artillery initiated preparatory bombardment for Operation Plunder, German forward observers witnessed something that challenged comprehension. 4,000 Allied guns commenced simultaneous fire, creating a barrier of steel and explosive force that transformed darkness into daylight. The barrage achieved such intensity that German soldiers positioned 30 kilometers distant felt continuous ground tremors for 4 solid hours. Windows shattered in villages 40 kilometers from the bombardment zone. Lieutenant Friedrich Paulus, nephew of the Stalingrad commander and serving with the 181st Division, composed a letter to his mother that survived the war's end, describing how American forces expended more shells in a single hour than German forces received across an entire month, how each gun apparently enjoyed unlimited ammunition, how the earth itself seemed to rebel against such punishment, entire forests vanishing, hills being reshaped, rivers altering their courses, concluding that this represented not artillery, but terraforming through explosive force. Precisely at 0700 hours on March 24th, the sky filled with an armada that defied rational belief. British forces deployed 322 transport aircraft, carrying 3,837 paratroopers from East Anglian bases. Simultaneously, 298 American transport planes lifted off from airfields surrounding Paris, transporting 4,890 paratroopers of the 17th Airborne Division. Behind them came the gliders, 906 American Waco gliders, transporting 4,810 soldiers along with vehicles, artillery pieces, and even light tanks. British forces contributed another 440 Horsa and Hamilcar gliders to this aerial invasion. German defenders found themselves paralysed by the spectacle. Obergefreiter Johann Becker of the 84th Division would later testify that they had witnessed large formations previously, had observed 100-plane raids, but this was fundamentally different because the sky turned black with aircraft, transport planes, gliders, fighters, bombers, as if the entire aviation industries of America and Britain had simultaneously taken flight. Some soldiers simply sat down and stared. Others discarded their weapons. What purpose existed in fighting the sky itself? Oberst Wilhelm von Steuben, commanding an anti-aircraft regiment near Wessel, confronted an impossible tactical dilemma. His regiment possessed 114 heavy and 712 light anti-aircraft guns positioned around expected drop zones, representing the largest concentration of anti-aircraft defences the Wehrmacht had assembled since Berlin's defence began. Yet this proved meaningless against the approaching scale. His later memoirs recorded how they had been assured that Allies lacked transport aircraft, that fuel shortages would limit any airborne operation, yet they came in numbers that darkened the Sunday sky. The airlift consisted of over 540 transport aircraft, plus more than 1,300 glider and tug aircraft combined. His gunners stood transfixed, forgetting to fire, simply staring at this demonstration of infinite resources. When they did fire, it resembled shooting arrows at a thunderstorm. They might strike individual raindrops, but the storm continued regardless. Allied planners had calculated German anti-aircraft capabilities with actuarial precision. They knew exactly how many aircraft German guns could theoretically engage. They sent 3 times that number. They had conducted massive flak suppression with fighter bombers during the hours before transport aircraft arrived, cratering gun positions and destroying ammunition supplies. When German guns did fire, they faced a terrible choice between engaging the transports and being destroyed by fighter escorts, or engaging the fighters and watching transports deliver their cargo unmolested. The gliders themselves represented a revolution in military logistics that no German commander had anticipated or prepared for. British Hamilcar gliders, the giants of the assault, carried M22 Locust tanks specifically designed for airborne operations. These tanks weighed just 6.7 tons, with armour only 12.5 mm thick, but carried gyro-stabilised 37 mm guns that could engage German positions immediately upon landing. German doctrine, refined through years of experience, held definitively that tanks could not be delivered by air. Yet here they were, dropping from the sky like steel rain. General Major Eugen Meindl, one of Germany's most experienced paratroop commanders and a pioneer of airborne warfare, watched the operation from his command post 10 kilometers from the drop zones. His aide-de-camp recorded his reaction as one of professional devastation. They had invented airborne warfare, shown the world at Rotterdam, at Eben Emael, at Crete, written the textbook. But what they were witnessing was not from their textbook, he observed. This was not military art, but industrial brutality. They had manufactured an airborne assault the way Krupp manufactured steel, the way IG Farben manufactured chemicals. Quantity had achieved its own quality. The operation's speed shattered every assumption in German military doctrine. German defensive planning, refined through 5 years of war, assumed that any airborne force would require at least 24 hours to consolidate after landing. This was based on their own experiences and observations from Crete, Sicily, and Normandy. Scattered drops, confused units, lost equipment, these were considered inevitable friction of airborne operations. The Allies had solved these problems through overwhelming mass and meticulous planning. Unlike Operation Market Garden 6 months earlier, where drops were spread over multiple days across 60 miles, the entire Operation Varsity force was delivered simultaneously in a single lift, concentrated in an area just 5 miles by 6 miles. Within 3 hours of landing, Allied airborne forces had secured all their primary objectives. German counterattack forces, assembled based on the 24-hour assumption, arrived to find fortified positions already established, anti-tank guns in place, and the airborne forces beginning offensive operations of their own. But the bridges were the revelation that truly broke German morale. Within hours of securing bridgeheads, Allied engineers began constructing Bailey bridges with unprecedented speed. The Bailey Bridge system was a masterpiece of engineering reduced to its simplest form. Every piece was interchangeable, every joint was identical, every panel could connect to every other panel. No piece was unique. No specialized skills were required beyond basic training. At Rhine, 25 kilometers north of Wesel, the Royal Canadian Engineers began constructing what would be called Blackfriars Bridge on March 26th. The bridge would stretch 1,803 feet across the Rhine, making it the longest Bailey bridge built to that point in history. German observers watched in disbelief as the bridge grew at a rate of 70 feet per hour. 227 truckloads of bridging equipment arrived in perfect sequence. 9,500 man-hours of labour were organised with such efficiency that no worker stood idle for more than seconds at a time. After the Ludendorff Bridge collapsed on March 17th, killing 28 American engineers, US forces had simply shifted to other crossings. Within hours, they had completed a treadway bridge 600 metres downstream. Within days, a pontoon bridge, then a Bailey bridge, then another, and another. The Rhine, which had protected Germany for 2,000 years, which had stopped Caesar's legions and Napoleon's armies, was being crossed as casually as a village stream. General der Panzertruppe Hasso von Manteuffel, one of Germany's most successful armoured commanders, visited the front on March 25th. His report to Field Marshal Model was stark. The Americans had made bridging a mathematical problem with a predetermined solution. While German forces calculated each timber, measured each span, considered each load, the Americans simply trucked in prefabricated sections and connected them according to formula. The Bailey Bridge could be modified for different lengths and strengths without changing the basic components: single for light loads, double for medium, triple for the heaviest tanks. They had removed the art from engineering and replaced it with multiplication. The psychological collapse among German troops was accelerating. Units that had fought tenaciously for months began surrendering en masse. The 2nd Parachute Regiment, elite troops who had jumped at Crete, simply laid down their arms when confronted with the reality of what they faced. On the afternoon of March 24th, after the airborne forces had been on the ground for less than 8 hours, 240 American B-24 Liberator bombers appeared at 400 feet altitude. They weren't bombing, they were delivering 600 tons of supplies, dropped by parachute directly to the airborne forces: ammunition, medical supplies, food, even replacement weapons. German logistics officers calculated that this single supply drop exceeded what an entire German corps might receive in a month of combat. When Field Marshal Model was informed that the Allies had dropped 2 complete divisions in a single morning, with more arriving by glider every hour, he reportedly sat in silence for several minutes before saying that the war was truly lost, that they were not fighting armies, but fighting the entire productive capacity of America. The integration of airborne and ground forces proceeded with clockwork precision that German doctrine said was impossible. By the afternoon of March 24th, less than 8 hours after the first parachute opened, the British 15th Scottish Division had linked up with both airborne divisions. Ground forces that had crossed the Rhine in assault boats during the night were shaking hands with paratroopers who had landed that morning. German military theory, based on hard-won experience at Crete, where German paratroopers had taken days to become combat effective, held that airborne forces would require at least 48 hours to organise after landing. The Allied forces were combat effective within hours, some within minutes of landing. The C-46 Commando aircraft employed in Operation Varsity represented another level of American adaptation. These aircraft could carry 36 paratroopers, an entire platoon, compared to 18 in the older C-47s. German Junkers Ju-52 transports, which had served since the Spanish Civil War, could carry 18 paratroopers. The Americans were delivering airborne forces at double the rate Germany had ever achieved, even at the height of German airborne operations in 1941. But the C-46 had a fatal flaw that revealed American attitudes toward warfare. The aircraft lacked self-sealing fuel tanks. When hit by anti-aircraft fire, they burst into flames. 19 of 72 C-46 were lost on March 24th, 14 burning in mid-air with paratroopers still aboard. Yet the operation continued without pause. The Americans had calculated probable losses and sent enough aircraft to absorb them. They treated human tragedy as a statistical probability, acceptable losses in an industrial equation. The variety of specialized equipment stunned German professionals who understood that each piece of equipment represented years of development, testing, and massive investment. Germany had prototypes and concepts. The Allies had production lines churning out hundreds of each type. When the Luftwaffe attempted to interfere with Operation Varsity, the results were catastrophic for German forces. They had assembled 375 single-engine fighters, 260 twin-engine fighters, and 40 of their precious Messerschmitt Me-262 jets for what they hoped would be a decisive intervention. They managed to shoot down 56 Allied aircraft, including 21 transport planes. But the Allies had sent over 3,000 aircraft in total. The loss rate was less than 2%. The Allies simply absorbed these losses and continued operations without any visible impact on the mission. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, former General der Jagdflieger and Germany's most famous fighter commander, observed the operation from a position near Münster. They could see them coming from 50 kilometers away, he noted. Thousands of aircraft in perfect formation. They had perhaps 30 operational fighters in the entire sector. It was like throwing pebbles at an avalanche. They didn't even alter course when attacked. They simply continued their mission, accepting losses as a cost of business. The human cost was real, but treated with industrial detachment. The 17th Airborne Division suffered 159 killed, 522 wounded, and 840 missing in the first day. The British 6th Airborne suffered similar losses. Combined, over 2,000 Allied airborne soldiers were casualties on March 24th. Yet these losses, which would have destroyed German airborne capability for months, were absorbed without affecting operational tempo. Reserve units were already prepared. Replacement equipment was already loaded. The machine continued without pause. The German elite units fared even worse by comparison. The 7th and 8th Fallschirmjäger divisions, Germany's premier paratrooper formations that had executed the assault on Crete, had been reduced to barely 900 men each through months of grinding combat. They watched from their defensive positions as the Allies dropped 20 times their number in a single morning. These were not elite troops, carefully selected and trained for years. Many American paratroopers had been civilians 18 months earlier. Yet they descended from the sky in numbers that made individual quality irrelevant. The bridges kept appearing with mechanical regularity. The 148th Engineer Combat Battalion, with assistance from additional units, built a 1,258-foot floating Bailey Bridge at Remagen in less than 2 days, finishing at 07:15 hours on March 20th. German engineers calculated such a bridge should require at least 2 weeks to construct with experienced crews. The Americans used soldiers who had been civilians a year earlier. At Bad Honnef, 9 kilometers upstream from Remagen, the 254th Engineer Combat Battalion constructed another tactical bridge on March 22nd. At Wallach, the 17th Armoured Engineer Battalion built a heavy pontoon bridge capable of carrying the heaviest tanks. At Rheinberg, another Bailey Bridge. At Buderich, a railroad bridge converted for vehicle traffic. Each bridge appeared faster than the last as engineers refined their procedures, turning construction into pure process. The medical support for the airborne operation demonstrated another dimension of Allied superiority. Field hospitals were dropped by glider with the assault waves. Operating theatres, X-ray machines, blood banks and pharmaceutical supplies that German frontline units hadn't seen since 1942 were delivered by air to forces in combat. Penicillin, the miracle drug that Germany knew existed but couldn't produce in quantity, was distributed freely. Morphine was abundant, plasma was available by the litre. Communication systems represented yet another gulf between the two militaries. Radio sets by the hundreds, telephone wire by the thousands of meters, signal equipment of every type, all dropped in quantities that German forces could never match. The Allies had achieved something German signal officers considered impossible: reliable communication between airborne forces and supporting artillery from the moment of landing. German forces, meanwhile, often relied on runners and signal flags, methods unchanged since the First World War. The two airborne divisions involved in Operation Varsity captured approximately 3,000 German soldiers, while suffering roughly 2,000 casualties themselves. Many Germans surrendered not from cowardice, but from recognition of the futility of resistance. They had watched the sky fill with aircraft, seen bridges appear overnight, observed unlimited supplies delivered by air. Resistance seemed not just futile, but absurd. By March 27th, the Allied bridgehead was 35 miles wide and 20 miles deep. German doctrine called for immediate counterattacks to eliminate bridgeheads before they could consolidate. But the Allies consolidated faster than German forces could concentrate for counterattacks. By the end of March, all 4 US armies fighting in Western Europe were across the Rhine. The First Army under Courtney Hodges, the Third Army under George Patton, the Ninth Army under William Simpson, the 15th Army under Leonard Gero. Each crossing presented German defenders with an identical nightmare, each confrontation forcing them to acknowledge the reality of American resources. On March 30th, Field Marshal Walter Model held his last staff conference at his headquarters in the Ruhr Pocket. According to his Chief of Staff, General Major Karl Wegener, Model informed his officers that they had witnessed the future of warfare, and they were not in it. The Americans had made war a problem of production management. They scheduled battles like train timetables. They delivered armies like cargo. They built bridges like automobiles. They were watching the death not just of the Wehrmacht, but of war as they understood it. Model issued his final order dissolving Army Group B on April 15, 1945. 6 days later, on April 21st, rather than surrender, he walked into a forest near Duisburg and shot himself. His last written words stated that the enemy's material superiority had become overwhelming, that further resistance was futile. It was an epitaph not just for an army, but for an entire concept of warfare. By April 10th, even before Model's final order, Army Group B had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Over 300,000 German soldiers surrendered in the Ruhr Pocket, the largest capitulation of German forces in the war. Many had not been defeated in battle. They had simply recognized the futility of fighting an enemy with unlimited resources. The bridges remained after the war ended, monuments to American industrial methodology. German engineer officers, now prisoners, were sometimes employed to help dismantle them. Each bridge was identical to every other, each joint perfect, each span precise. They stood as symbols of a new kind of warfare, where victory was determined not on battlefields, but in factories, not by generals, but by production managers. General Franz Halder, the former chief of the General Staff, conducted a post-war study of Allied bridging operations for the US Army Historical Division. His conclusion was stark. The Allied bridge-building capacity represented the ultimate expression of industrial warfare. They did not outfight Germany. They outproduced Germany. They turned the Rhine from Germany's shield into merely another production problem to be solved through systematic processes. In 1950, General Oberst Kurt Student, the founder of German airborne forces who had planned and executed the attacks on Eben Emael and Crete, wrote a final assessment of Operation Varsity. They had created airborne warfare at Eben Emael in 1940, he acknowledged. They had perfected it at Crete in 1941. The Americans and British industrialized it over the Rhine in 1945. They took German innovation and made it routine. They transformed the extraordinary into the ordinary. That was how they won the war, he concluded, not through superior tactics or strategy, but through the ability to mass-produce military solutions. The German officers who witnessed Operation Varsity and the Rhine crossings never recovered from the psychological impact. They had seen warfare transformed from a contest of will and skill into a problem of production management. In a single day, the Allies had dropped more paratroopers than Germany had imagined could be employed in the entire war. They had built bridges faster than Germany could destroy them. They had made the impossible routine through systematic application of resources. The Rhine crossings of March 1945 marked more than a military defeat for Germany. They represented the complete psychological demolition of the German officer corps' worldview. Everything they believed about warfare, about rivers as barriers, about the limitations of airborne forces, about the importance of operational art, was shattered by the overwhelming application of productive capacity to military problems. German leaders had never imagined that American engineers would construct bridges with such speed because they had never imagined warfare as a production problem. They had prepared for battles and found themselves confronting assembly lines. They had trained for war as they understood it and discovered that America had changed the very definition of war itself. The bridges across the Rhine stood as monuments not to military genius, but to industrial methodology, systematic planning, and mass production. They were not built by warriors, but by engineers following procedures with interchangeable parts. And in that transformation lay both Germany's defeat and the future of warfare itself, forever changed from an art requiring genius and courage to a science requiring only productive capacity and systematic procedures. The German commanders, who had spent lifetimes mastering the art of war, discovered in those terrible days of March 1945 that art had become obsolete. Production had won. The factory had defeated the battlefield. Mass output had triumphed over military tradition. What makes this story particularly striking is how completely it represented a paradigm shift in human conflict. For thousands of years, warfare had been understood as an endeavour where individual courage, tactical brilliance, and operational genius determined outcomes. The great captains of history, from Alexander to Napoleon, had won their victories through superior decision-making, better training, and inspired leadership. The Rhine crossings demonstrated that this ancient understanding had become irrelevant in the face of industrial capacity. Consider the psychological journey of a German officer watching these events unfold. He had been trained in military academies where Clausewitz and Moltke were sacred texts. He had studied the campaigns of Frederick the Great and the elder Moltke's victories in 1870. He had participated in the stunning successes of 1939 through 1941, when German forces had seemed invincible precisely because of their superior training, doctrine, and leadership. Then, in a single day, he watched the sky fill with more aircraft than he had imagined existed, delivering soldiers and equipment in quantities that rendered all his training and experience meaningless. The Allies weren't better trained, they weren't more courageous, they weren't even necessarily more intelligent in their planning. They simply had more. More aircraft, more supplies, more bridging equipment, more ammunition, more medical supplies, more everything. And that more was organised with such systematic efficiency that it overwhelmed every traditional military virtue. The Bailey Bridge itself deserves deeper consideration as a symbol of this transformation. Donald Bailey, its inventor, was not a military genius. He was an engineer who enjoyed building model bridges as a hobby. His innovation was not a stroke of tactical brilliance, but a solution to a production problem. How could a bridge be designed so that every piece was identical, so that no specialized skills were required, so that construction became a simple matter of following a procedure? The answer revolutionized military engineering not through inspiration but through systematic thinking. Each panel was the same. Each pin was the same. Each connection point was the same. A bridge became not a unique structure requiring experienced craftsmen, but a standardized product that could be assembled by following instructions. This was not the work of a military mind, but of an industrial mind applied to military problems. The German response to this reveals something profound about military culture and institutional thinking. German officers were trained to see war as an art form, where individual brilliance could overcome material disadvantages. This belief was reinforced by their early war successes, where superior training and doctrine had allowed them to defeat numerically superior enemies. France had more tanks in 1940. The Soviet Union had vastly more soldiers in 1941. Yet Germany had won these campaigns through superior operational art. This created a dangerous confidence that quality would always triumph over quantity, that military genius could always find a way to victory regardless of material disadvantages. The Rhine crossings destroyed this belief utterly and completely. When American forces began constructing multiple bridges simultaneously, German forces couldn't respond effectively because their doctrine assumed bridges were unique, vulnerable points that could be targeted and destroyed. But when bridges appeared faster than they could be destroyed, when new bridges emerged overnight to replace destroyed ones, when bridges became essentially disposable components in a larger system, German doctrine had no answer. They were trying to fight an industrial system with military tactics, and it was hopeless from the start. The speed of Allied construction particularly devastated German morale because it violated every assumption about time and preparation in warfare. Military operations were supposed to require time for planning, for assembling resources, for coordination. Yet the Allies seemed to operate according to factory schedules rather than military timelines. Bridges appeared according to production schedules. Supplies arrived according to delivery schedules. Reinforcements arrived according to transportation schedules. The entire enterprise ran like a massive logistics operation rather than a military campaign. The airborne aspect of Operation Varsity compounds this industrial character. German airborne operations, at their peak, had been carefully planned operations using elite troops who had trained for years. Crete had involved approximately 22,000 paratroopers, and it had been considered a massive undertaking that required enormous resources and careful planning. The Germans had dropped these troops over several days, using every available transport aircraft in their inventory. It was considered the absolute maximum effort Germany could sustain. Then, in March 1945, the Allies dropped 16,000 paratroopers in a single morning, in a single area, in a single operation. And these weren't even elite troops in the German sense. Many had been civilians months earlier. They were trained, certainly, but not with the years of preparation German Fallschirmjäger received. Yet they descended in such numbers that individual training became almost irrelevant. The system compensated for any individual deficiencies through sheer mass and overwhelming support. This gets to something fundamental about the American way of war that emerged during World War II. American military culture, shaped by a society that had industrialized earlier and more thoroughly than Germany, approached war as an engineering problem to be solved through systematic application of resources. Where German officers saw war as an art requiring genius, American officers saw war as a problem requiring systematic solutions. Where German doctrine emphasized the importance of the individual commander's decision-making, American doctrine emphasized the importance of systems and procedures that would work regardless of individual genius. Where Germany relied on elite units with superior training, America created systems that could produce acceptable results with average units and average soldiers. This wasn't because Americans lacked military talent or courage. It was because American military culture, shaped by industrial society, naturally thought in terms of systems and production rather than art and genius. The medical support exemplifies this systemic thinking. German forces by 1945 were desperately short of medical supplies. Morphine was rationed, antibiotics were almost non-existent, plasma was a rare luxury. Yet Allied airborne forces landed with complete field hospitals, with supplies that would have seemed lavish to German soldiers, with penicillin distributed freely to prevent infections. This wasn't because Allied medical personnel were more compassionate or more skilled. It was because the Allied system had solved the production problem of antibiotics and had created logistical systems capable of delivering medical supplies to the front line in quantities that seemed miraculous to German observers. American industry could produce penicillin in quantity. American logistics could deliver it to combat zones. American doctrine emphasized keeping soldiers alive and returning them to combat quickly. The entire system, from factory to front line, had been designed to support soldiers with material resources rather than expecting them to endure through sheer toughness. The communication systems reveal the same pattern. German forces often relied on runners carrying messages because they lacked sufficient radios and telephone wire. Radio sets were relatively scarce and often unreliable. Telephone networks required extensive wire that was difficult to transport and easy to damage. So German forces reverted to methods unchanged since ancient times, human runners carrying messages. Allied forces, meanwhile, dropped radio sets by the hundreds, telephone wire by kilometers, signal equipment of every type. Not because Allied signal officers were more clever, but because Allied industry could produce these items in quantity and Allied logistics could deliver them. The system provided what soldiers needed through industrial production and systematic delivery, rather than expecting soldiers to make do with inadequate resources. When German defenders saw American supply drops in the afternoon of March 24th, bringing 600 tons of supplies to forces that had been on the ground less than 8 hours, they were witnessing something that had no precedent in military history. German doctrine assumed that airborne forces would be weak and vulnerable for at least a day after landing, operating with limited ammunition and supplies until ground forces could relieve them. This assumption was based on sound military logic. Airborne forces could only carry what they jumped with, and soldiers have human limitations on what they can carry. Resupply would have to wait until ground forces linked up or until subsequent airlift operations could be organized. Yet here were airborne forces receiving massive resupply within hours, with supplies delivered by heavy bombers flying at low altitude in broad daylight, unmolested by German fighters because Allied air superiority was so complete that bomber aircraft could operate as cargo planes. The audacity of using 4-engine bombers as supply aircraft, flying at 400 feet in combat zones, illustrated Allied confidence and abundance. These were aircraft that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars each, operated by trained crews, burning enormous quantities of fuel. Using them as cargo aircraft represented a casual expenditure of resources that German forces could never match. The glider operations particularly exemplify the industrial approach to military problems. Gliders were, in essence, disposable aircraft. They were towed to the combat zone, released, landed once, and were abandoned. Some might be recovered later, but the assumption was that each glider would be used once and discarded. This approach seemed insane to German officers trained to carefully husband resources. Aircraft were expensive and scarce. Using them once and abandoning them appeared wasteful beyond comprehension, yet from an industrial perspective it made perfect sense. Gliders were cheap to produce compared to powered aircraft. They required no engines, no complex systems, minimal training to fly. They could be manufactured by furniture factories and woodworking shops that couldn't build powered aircraft. So the Allies built them by the thousands and used them once, accepting that this was more efficient than trying to recover and reuse them. The entire concept represented industrial thinking applied to military problems, where disposable components made sense if they served the system's needs. The Hamilcar gliders carrying tanks embodied this industrial logic perfectly. Tanks had always been ground weapons, transported by ship or rail or driven under their own power. Delivering them by air seemed impossible because of weight constraints. German doctrine held definitively that this was impossible, and with good reason, because normal tanks weighed far too much for air transport. So the Allies didn't try to transport normal tanks by air. Instead, they designed a tank specifically for airborne operations, accepting limitations in armour and firepower to achieve weight reduction, then built gliders large enough to carry these specialised tanks, then trained crews to fly these enormous gliders into combat zones. The entire enterprise represented systematic problem-solving. If doctrine says tanks can't be delivered by air, redesign the tanks and build specialised aircraft rather than accepting the limitation. This willingness to redesign equipment and develop specialised systems to overcome doctrinal limitations characterised the Allied approach throughout the war. German forces, meanwhile, remained trapped in traditional thinking, even as they witnessed its obsolescence. German doctrine emphasized making do with available resources, adapting tactics to material limitations, relying on superior training and leadership to overcome disadvantages. These were sound military virtues that had served Germany well in earlier wars, but they were useless against an enemy that simply eliminated material limitations through industrial production. When the Allies needed more transport aircraft, they built more. When they needed more gliders, they built more. When they needed more supplies, they produced more. Material limitations that German doctrine treated as fixed constraints became variables that Allied industry could adjust by increasing production. This fundamental difference in thinking made traditional German military virtues irrelevant. The psychological impact on German soldiers watching this industrial warfare unfold cannot be overstated. Imagine being a German soldier who had fought bravely for years, who had seen comrades die, who had endured hardship and danger, who took pride in his unit's accomplishments and his own courage. Then he watches the sky fill with aircraft beyond counting, watches supplies dropped in quantities he's never imagined, watches bridges appear overnight, watches enemy forces consolidate positions in hours that should take days. Every traditional military virtue he values, courage, discipline, training, experience, becomes meaningless in the face of overwhelming material superiority. His training doesn't matter when the enemy has 10 times more ammunition. His courage doesn't matter when the enemy can simply saturate positions with artillery until nothing survives. His experience doesn't matter when the enemy operates according to industrial schedules rather than military timelines. Faced with this reality, surrender becomes not cowardice, but rational acknowledgement of futility. The Ruhr Pocket, where over 300,000 German soldiers surrendered in April 1945, represented the culmination of this psychological collapse. These weren't cowards or defeated soldiers in the traditional sense. Many units remained intact, with weapons and ammunition capable of fighting. They surrendered because they recognized that continued resistance was pointless. They had watched the Rhine crossings. They had seen the scale of Allied resources. They understood that defeat was inevitable and that dying pointlessly served no purpose. This was a rational calculation based on clear-eyed assessment of material reality, not a failure of courage or discipline. Field Marshal Model's suicide after dissolving Army Group B represented his personal inability to accept this new reality. He was a product of traditional military culture, where honour and courage mattered more than life itself, where surrender was shameful even when rational. His final words, stating that enemy material superiority had become overwhelming and further resistance was futile, acknowledged reality even as his suicide rejected it. He understood intellectually that Germany had lost, that continued fighting only caused additional suffering, that material superiority had rendered military virtue obsolete. But emotionally, he could not accept a world where courage and skill no longer mattered, where wars were won by factories rather than battlefield genius. The post-war assessments by German officers reveal their ongoing struggle to process what had happened. General Kurt Student, founder of German airborne forces, acknowledged in 1950 that the Allies had industrialized what Germany had invented. This was not a bitter complaint, but a recognition of fundamental transformation. Germany had created airborne warfare as a military art form, where elite troops using innovative tactics could achieve dramatic results. The Allies had transformed it into an industrial process, where mass production and systematic procedures replaced individual excellence. Student recognized that this transformation represented a superior approach in total war, even as it rendered his life's work and expertise obsolete. His assessment that the Allies won not through superior tactics or strategy, but through mass-producing military solutions was both accurate and devastating, acknowledging that everything he valued in military art had been superseded by industrial capacity. General Franz Halder's post-war study of Allied bridging operations for the U.S. Army Historical Division reached similar conclusions. The Allies had not outfought Germany, they had outproduced Germany. This distinction matters profoundly. In traditional warfare, victory went to forces that fought better, that maneuvered more skillfully, that demonstrated superior courage and discipline. The Rhine crossings demonstrated that these traditional military virtues had become secondary to productive capacity. Allied forces might not have been better trained than German forces. They might not have been more courageous. They might not have demonstrated superior tactical skill. But they had more resources, organized those resources more systematically, and applied them more efficiently. And that was sufficient for victory because quantity, properly organized, had achieved its own quality. The transformation of warfare from art to science, from human endeavor to industrial process, found its ultimate expression in those bridges across the Rhine. Each bridge was identical. Each was constructed using the same components, the same procedures, the same methods. There was no room for individual genius or artistic expression. Engineers followed procedures. Components were assembled according to specifications. The result was predictable, reliable, and efficient. Beauty didn't matter. Elegance didn't matter. Innovation didn't matter. What mattered was that the bridge worked, that it appeared on schedule, that it served its systematic purpose in the larger industrial process of warfare. This transformation proved irreversible. The Second World War marked the definitive end of warfare as primarily a human endeavor where courage, skill, and genius determined outcomes. Modern warfare became increasingly a contest of industrial and technological capacity, where victory went to nations that could outproduce enemies regardless of military virtue. The bridges stood when the war ended 6 weeks later, perfect in their uniformity, identical in their construction, monuments to a new age where wars would be won not by better soldiers but by better factories, not by superior courage but by superior production, not by military genius but by industrial capacity. They were bridges not just across the Rhine, but from one era of warfare to another, from the age of warriors to the age of production lines, from warfare as art to warfare as industrial process.